On 18 April 1942, the eastern sea frontier ordered waterfront lights and sky signs doused, and the Eastern Defence Command of the Army ordered a stringent demout on 18 May. If one or two torpedoes did not fatally hole the attacked ship, the submarine finished her off by shell fire. In the spring, when the nights became shorter and the ineffectiveness of our anti-submarine warfare had been demonstrated, the U-boats became bolder and attacked in broad daylight, even surfaced. Although they invariably attacked without warning, they commonly gave the crew a chance to get away before opening gunfire and refrained from machine gunning survivors in lifeboats, as had been done freely in the early part of the war. Survivors were often questioned as to the identity of the ship and the nature of her cargo, were sometimes offered water, provisions, or cigarettes, and dismissed with a standardized joke about sending the bill to Roosevelt or Churchill. The healthy and sunburned German submariners appeared to be having a glorious field day. They later referred to this period as the happy time. This assault temporarily stunned the defense forces of the United States and Canada. Such protection as the Navy furnished to shipping was pitifully inadequate. Destroyers could not be spared from the transatlantic route. The entire anti-submarine fleet, when the U-boat struck along the east coast, consisted of 3 110-foot wooden subchasers and 2 173-foot patrol craft, together with a score of Eagle boats left over from World War I and a few converted yachts. Orders for 60 patrol crafts and subchasers had already been placed, but they were not due for completion until the summer and fall of 1942. Consequently, there were no escorts to organize coastal convoys, and Admiral King judged rightly that a convoy without escort was worse than no convoy at all. The question has often been asked why the Navy was so unprovided with these indispensable small craft for anti-submarine warfare. The reason was its desperate concentration on building destroyers and larger ships to fight an impending two-ocean war. Small craft were neglected in the belief that they could be improvised and rapidly reproduced in quantities at small shipbuilding yards. It was the same with anti-submarine aircraft. Vice Admiral Adolphus Andrews, Commander Eastern Sea Frontier, which extended from the Canadian border to Jacksonville, Florida, had no naval planes at his disposal in December capable of searching far out to sea. Offshore air patrol was therefore undertaken by the 9 available planes of the Army Air Force. But by 1 April 1942, the anti-submarine patrol had been built up to 84 Army and 86 Navy planes at 19 bases between Bangor, Maine, and Jacksonville. The total number of Allied, American, and neutral merchant vessels sunk in the North Atlantic in January 1942, between our coast and the western approaches to the British Isles, was 58. Only 3 of these were in transatlantic convoys. The tonnage lost was 307,059 gross, of which 132,348 tons consisted of tankers of 5,000 to 12,000 tons each. The rest were mostly freighters up to 10,000 tons each. In February, the score was almost identical for the same area, but the sinkings in the eastern sea frontier alone passed the 100,000-ton mark, and new zones were raided, east coast of Florida, and, in the latter half of the month, the Caribbean. Admiral Andrews's attempt to hunt U-boats with 2 or 3 destroyers taken out of transatlantic duty was a costly failure. U-578 sank destroyer Jacob Jones off the Delaware Capes on the last day of February. The aggregate loss increased in March 1942. 28 vessels of 159 to 340 tons sunk by U-boats in the eastern sea frontier alone, 15 more of 92,321 tons, over half of it tanker tonnage in the Gulf and Caribbean, 86 vessels and almost 500,000 gross tons for the entire Atlantic. The coastline from Norfolk to Wilmington was the scene of numerous sinkings. Submarines lay off Diamond Shoals Buoy, picking them off. At least 3 U-boats maintained patrol off Cape Hatteras, lying on the bottom by day and hunting at night. Some of the details of these sinkings, especially of the tankers, are pitiful to relate. Oil scum ignited by signal flares on life preservers, men attempting to swim in a heavy viscous layer of fuel oil, men trying to swim underwater to avoid flames. A Chilean freighter was torpedoed and sunk 30 miles off Ambrose Channel, New York, and only 1 man survived. And a heavy American escort, including battleships and cruisers as well as destroyers. These convoys also enjoyed all the blimp and airplane escort that was available at each end of the route. Heavy weather was often encountered, and an occasional sound contact on a submarine was made, but a speed of 12.5 to 14.5 knots was maintained, and not a ship or a soldier was lost. Fueling at sea was another problem. The old short-legged 1,200-ton destroyers had been designed in the light of World War I experience, when all that was expected of an escort was a 48-hour run outbound or inbound. But the necessities of escort duty in 1941 to 1942 were such that every United States destroyer had to cover the route Argentia mid-ocean meeting point Iceland, or the reverse, which required at least 10 days steaming. It was impossible for such ships in winter weather to conduct the active, aggressive patrolling enjoined on all by the fate of USS Kearney and Reuben James. Before the war, fueling at sea had been practiced largely in calm weather, and only from battleships. Now it had to be done from merchant tankers. On one transatlantic convoy, 4 tankers, rigged for ocean fueling abreast or astern, made 20 fuelings of escorts, 4 or 5 times on some of them. The scarcity of suitable escorts was the greatest handicap during this period. Coast Guard cutter Campbell, employed as escort in November 1941, proved so effective that most of her sister ships of the Treasury class were diverted to this duty. These big seagoing cutters had everything that a destroyer had except speed and torpedoes, and seldom does an opportunity arise to use torpedoes in escort of convoy. United States Coast Guard cutter Alexander Hamilton was torpedoed and sunk 10 miles off Iceland, 29 January 1942, when towing a disabled storeship. Air cover at this period could only be provided at each end of the transatlantic route, and from Iceland. In anti-submarine warfare, air search proved so valuable for locating and destroying U-boats that every effort was made to extend and enlarge the coverage. By the end of 1942, a squadron of 4-engine Liberators operating out of Greenland proved a great help in mid-ocean, but even they left a big dark pocket around the Azores, where U-boats operated with impunity and even refueled from special submarine milch cows sent out for that purpose. The Navy was eager to light up this pocket by occupying the Azores and installing airfields there, but Dr. Salazar, Premier of Portugal, would not allow this until late 1943, when he had decided that the Allies were going to win, and the Allies could not violate their own principles by seizing part of a neutral country. A convoy is beautiful, whether seen from a deck or from the sky. The inner core of stolid ships in several columns is never equally spaced, for each has her individuality. One is always straggling or ranging ahead until the Commodore becomes vexed and signals angrily, "Number so-and-so, take station and keep station around the merchant ships is thrown the screen like a loose-jointed necklace, the beads lunging to port or starboard, and then snapping back as though pulled by a mighty submarine elastic. Each destroyer nervous and questing, all eyes topside looking for the enemy, sound gear below listening for him, radar antennae like cat's whiskers feeling for him. On dark nights, only a few shapes of ships a little darker that the black water can be discerned. One consults the radar screen to ascertain that the flock is all there. To one coming topside for the dawn watch, it is a recurring wonder to see the same ships day after day, each in her appointed station, each with her characteristic top hamper, bow wave, lift and dip. The inevitable straggler, the inveterate smoker, the vessel with an old shellback master who knew more about shipping 40 years ago than any goddamn gold braid in a tin can, and whose sullen fury at being convoyed translates itself into belated turns, unanswered signals and insolent comebacks. When air cover is furnished, there are darting, swooping planes about the convoy. Upon approaching port, the stately silver bubble of a blimp comes out, swaying in the breeze and blinking a cheery welcome. There is nothing beautiful, however, about a night attack on a convoy, unless you see it from a submarine's periscope. A torpedo hit is signalled by a flash and a great orange flare, followed by a muffled roar. Guns crack at imaginary targets, star shell breaks out, a rescue ship hurries to the scene of the sinking, and sailors in other ships experience a helpless fury and dread. If the convoy has a weak escort, it can only execute an emergency turn and trust that the rest of the wolf pack will be thrown off or driven down. If the escort is sufficient, a killer group peels off, searching relentlessly with radar and sonar, while everyone stands by hoping to feel underfoot the push of distant depth charges that tells of a fight with a submerged enemy. The only American escorted convoy that lost heavily during the first 4 months of 1942 was on 67 of 35 ships in 8 columns, which crossed westward during the full moon of February. The ocean escort, consisting of the United States destroyers Edison, Nicholson, Lear and Bernadou, under Commander A.C. Murdaugh, steamed south to join from Iceland. Shortly after they took over, at 1:05 p.m. February 22, 2 ships were torpedoed and sunk. In the early hours of 24 February, 4 more were torpedoed and 2 sank. All day the screen made wide sweeps and aggressive patrols, which continued throughout the night. 2 U-boats were sighted in the moonlight and depth-charged, but both escaped. Commander Murdaugh's officers were alert and zealous, but deficient in attack technique. Escort units, composed usually of 2 United States destroyers and 4 Canadian corvettes, directed by such seasoned commanders as W.K. Phillips in Mayo, P.R. Heineman in Benson, H.C. Fitz in Niblack, John B. Heffernan in Gleaves and R.W. Hungerford in Bristol, were getting the ships across safely, but they were not sinking any U-boats. When March came in like a lion, weather became more deadly than the submarine. A convoy cannot heave to like a single steamship, because vessels act so differently hove to that collisions and wide scattering would result. It has to keep going somewhere, somehow. Except for 2 ships sunk out of Convoy on 68, the casualties in March were caused by the weather. A prompt attack by U-boats on American coastal shipping should have been anticipated, since they had done just that during World War I. No U-boats happened to be in position to raid American coasts when Germany declared war on the United States in December 1941, but Admiral Dönitz chose 5 of his best aces, and followed them by 6 more to devastate the American East Coast shipping lanes. These originate in the St. Lawrence River, cross the Gulf of Maine, past New York, where at least 50 ships arrived and departed daily, and extend past the Capes of Delaware, the Chesapeake and Hatteras, into the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and down past the Bulge of Brazil. Operation Paukenschlag, Roll of the Drums, as the Germans called it, opened on 12 January 1942, when a British steamer was torpedoed and sunk about 300 miles east of Cape Cod by U-123. 2 days later, enemy submarines moved into the shipping bottleneck off Cape Hatteras. 3 tankers in succession were sunk on 14 and 15 January. Next day, the U-boats sank a Canadian lady boat and 2 freighters, then 3 tankers in succession and 3 more before the end of the month, 13 vessels in all, measuring 95,000 gross tons, and 70% of this tanker tonnage were lost in a little over 2 weeks. No more perfect setup for rapid and ruthless destruction could have been offered the German authoritarian sea lords. The massacre enjoyed by the U-boats along our Atlantic coast in 1942 was as much a national disaster as if saboteurs had destroyed 6 of our biggest war plants. The damage in the eastern sea frontier was wrought by no more than 12 U-boats operating at any one time, and every month the Germans were building 20 or more new 740 and 500-tonners. Each U-boat carried 14 torpedoes, including some of the new electrically propelled type that showed no air bubbles in the wake, so could not be sighted or dodged. In addition, they carried guns of sufficient caliber to sink most merchant vessels by shellfire alone. The 500-tonners carried enough fuel for a cruise of at least 42 days. Allowing 2 weeks for the outward passage and the same for homeward to a French port, they could spend 2 weeks in the Atlantic coastal lanes. Their usual tactics in the early months of 1942 were to approach a trade route at periscope depth, lie in wait on the surface at night, and launch torpedoes from seaward against a vessel whose silhouette might be seen against shorelights. One of the most reprehensible failures on our part was the neglect of local communities to dim their waterfront lights, or of military authorities to require them to do so, until 3 months after the submarine offensive started. When this obvious defense measure was first proposed, squawks went all the way from Atlantic City to southern Florida that the tourist season would be ruined. Miami and its luxurious suburbs threw up 6 miles of neon light glow, against which was silhouetted southbound shipping that hugged the shore to avoid the Gulf Stream. Ships were sunk and seamen drowned in order that the citizenry might enjoy pleasure as usual. Finally, on 18 April 1942, the eastern sea frontier ordered waterfront lights and sky signs doused, and the Eastern Defence Command of the Army ordered a stringent demout on 18 May. If 1 or 2 torpedoes did not fatally hole the attacked ship, the submarine finished her off by shell fire. In the spring, when the nights became shorter and the ineffectiveness of our anti-submarine warfare had been demonstrated, the U-boats became bolder and attacked in broad daylight, even surfaced. Although they invariably attacked without warning, they commonly gave the crew a chance to get away before opening gunfire and refrained from machine gunning survivors in lifeboats, as had been done freely in the early part of the war. Survivors were often questioned as to the identity of the ship and the nature of her cargo, were sometimes offered water, provisions, or cigarettes, and dismissed with a standardized joke about sending the bill to Roosevelt or Churchill. The healthy and sunburned German submariners appeared to be having a glorious field day. They later referred to this period as the happy time. This assault temporarily stunned the defense forces of the United States and Canada. Such protection as the Navy furnished to shipping was pitifully inadequate. Destroyers could not be spared from the transatlantic route. The entire anti-submarine fleet, when the U-boat struck along the east coast, consisted of 3 110-foot wooden sub-chasers and 2 173-foot patrol craft, together with a score of Eagle boats left over from World War I and a few converted yachts. Orders for 60 patrol crafts and sub-chasers had already been placed, but they were not due for completion until the summer and fall of 1942. Consequently, there were no escorts to organize coastal convoys, and Admiral King judged rightly that a convoy without escort was worse than no convoy at all. The question has often been asked why the Navy was so unprovided with these indispensable small craft for anti-submarine warfare. The reason was its desperate concentration on building destroyers and larger ships to fight an impending two-ocean war. Small craft were neglected in the belief that they could be improvised and rapidly reproduced in quantities at small shipbuilding yards. It was the same with anti-submarine aircraft. Vice Admiral Adolphus Andrews, Commander Eastern Sea Frontier, which extended from the Canadian border to Jacksonville, Florida, had no naval planes at his disposal in December capable of searching far out to sea. Offshore air patrol was therefore undertaken by the 9 available planes of the Army Air Force. But by 1 April 1942, the anti-submarine patrol had been built up to 84 Army and 86 Navy planes at 19 bases between Bangor, Maine, and Jacksonville. The total number of Allied, American, and neutral merchant vessels sunk in the North Atlantic in January 1942, between our coast and the western approaches to the British Isles, was 58. Only 3 of these were in transatlantic convoys. The tonnage lost was 307,059 gross, of which 132,348 tons consisted of tankers of 5,000 to 12,000 tons each. The rest were mostly freighters up to 10,000 tons each. In February, the score was almost identical for the same area, but the sinkings in the eastern sea frontier alone passed the 100,000-ton mark, and new zones were raided, east coast of Florida, and, in the latter half of the month, the Caribbean. Admiral Andrews's attempt to hunt U-boats with 2 or 3 destroyers taken out of transatlantic duty was a costly failure. U-578 sank destroyer Jacob Jones off the Delaware Capes on the last day of February. The aggregate loss increased in March 1942. 28 vessels of 159 to 340 tons sunk by U-boats in the eastern sea frontier alone, 15 more of 92,321 tons, over half of it tanker tonnage in the Gulf and Caribbean, 86 vessels and almost 500,000 gross tons for the entire Atlantic. The coastline from Norfolk to Wilmington was the scene of numerous sinkings. Submarines lay off Diamond Shoals buoy, picking them off. At least 3 U-boats maintained patrol off Cape Hatteras, lying on the bottom by day and hunting at night. Some of the details of these sinkings, especially of the tankers, are pitiful to relate. Oil scum ignited by signal flares on life preservers, men attempting to swim in a heavy viscous layer of fuel oil, men trying to swim underwater to avoid flames. A Chilean freighter was torpedoed and sunk 30 miles off Ambrose Channel, New York, and only one man survived. Admiral Dönitz was naturally delighted with the performance of his boys. On 15 June, he reported to Hitler the gratifying number of sinkings compared with the small number of submarines employed, and predicted vast possibilities through the rapid increase in number of U-boats and the use of supply submarines. He dwelt on the poor quality of American defenses, the heavy destruction of tankers, and the failure of new construction to replace shipping losses. In a press interview that summer, Dönitz declared, "Our submarines are operating close inshore along the coast of the United States of America, so that bathers and sometimes entire coastal cities are witnesses to that drama of war, whose visual climaxes are constituted by the red glorioles of blazing tankers." No frantic boast, this. Burning tankers were not infrequently sighted from fashionable Florida resorts, and on 15 June 2 large American freighters were torpedoed by a U-boat within full view of thousands of pleasure seekers at Virginia Beach. Having described the havoc wrought by the U-boats during the first 6 months of the war, we may now relate some of the principal countermeasures adopted, which bore fruit in the latter half of the year and in 1943. Of these, by far the most important were the building of more escort vessels, although the best of these, the destroyer Escort, did not come out until 1943, and the interlocking coastal convoys, which we have already mentioned. The amount of study, energy, and expense necessary to combat a few hundred U-boats is appalling. The major naval effort of the Allied navies in the Atlantic was so employed for 2 years. In money terms alone, counting the sunken ships and cargoes, time lost at sea, and expense of operating naval vessels and planes to protect the seaways, the efforts of the American republics and the British Empire amounted to some hundreds of billions of dollars, whilst the lives lost by submarine action reached tens of thousands. Beaten German authoritarians may take comfort in reflecting that no army, fleet, or other unit in World War II, with the exception of their own people who murdered defenseless civilians, wrought such destruction and misery as the U-boats. There was no administrative centre of the Navy's efforts against the U-boats until March 1942, when Admiral King designated Captain Wilder D. Baker to set up an anti-submarine section of his staff in Washington. This section was responsible for material, supply, development, and training. An important step toward unified control of merchant shipping was taken on 15 May 1942, when the Convoy and Routing Section of Chief of Naval Operations, headed by Rear Admiral M.K. Metcalf, became a section of Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet Headquarters. About 1 July, C&R assumed full responsibility for the routing and reporting of all merchant shipping in the United States strategic area and for troop convoys. Commander-in-Chief, Atlantic Fleet, Admiral Ingersoll, provided the escorts and many of the transports. C&R organised the convoy and, in conjunction with the British Admiralty, laid down its route. Until the 10th Fleet was organised in May 1943, Admiral Ingersoll directed anti-submarine warfare. Living on board his flagship USS Vixen, steaming from one Atlantic port to another as occasion required, he kept his finger on the U-boat pulse. The public knew nothing of him. Even to most of the Atlantic Fleet he remained a shadowy, almost a legendary figure. But to Admiral Ingersoll's sagacity and seasoned sea cunning, to use an Elizabethan phrase, the Allied nations owed in large measure their progress against the submarine in 1942 and 1943. Besides improved depth charges, which were tossed off a vessel's stern, 2 ahead-thrown weapons were adopted by the United States Navy in 1942, Hedgehog and Mousetrap. Hedgehog, adapted from a British design which Captain Paul Hammond called to the attention of the Royal Navy, consisted of a steel cradle from which projected 6 rows of spigots firing 24 projectiles. As the ship fired these ahead before breaking her sound contact with a submarine, it gave her a better chance of inflicting damage. Depth charges went off at the determined depth, whether they hit anything or not, but Hedgehog shells exploded only on contact. The smaller Mousetrap, which fired a pattern of 4 to 8 small rocket projectiles, was developed for patrol crafts and submarine chasers. Anti-submarine ships also mounted the usual types of naval ordnance suitable for their burthen. Machine guns proved to be useful in clearing a surfaced submarine's deck, but there is no record of any U-boat being sunk with a gun smaller than 3-inch. Both the British and ourselves, between the two wars, invented supersonic echo-ranging sound which they called ASDIC and we named sonar. Housed in a streamlined retractable dome which projected beneath the ship's bottom, but was operative only at moderate speeds owing to water noises, sonar could be employed in two ways: listening for the U-boat's propeller noises, and echo ranging with a sharp ping, which the U-boat's hull returned, the time giving the range and the direction indicating the bearing. The echo reached the operator with varying degrees of pitch, depending on the nature and movements of the target. This variation in the pitch, known as the Doppler effect, told a trained operator with a sensitive ear whether the target was a ship or a whale, whether it was stationary or moving, and its direction and speed. In order to thwart sonar, German submarines were equipped with Pillenwerfer. This device shot out from a special tube a multitude of small, stationary gas bubbles, which returned an echo similar to that of a submarine. Trained sound operators, however, could detect a submarine's echo from that returned by Pillenwerfer. There were many other pitfalls for inexperienced operators. Schools of blackfish, whales, wrecks, coral reefs, and even a layer of water of different temperature echoed in a way which only an expert could distinguish from echoes on a steel hull. Snapping shrimps on the ocean bottom made a curious crackling noise that disturbed sound listeners. The Navy's monthly anti-submarine warfare bulletin had to print special articles about the habits of cetaceans and crustaceans in order to diminish false alarms. Intensive training was necessary for a bluejacket to operate sonar, or an officer use it intelligently. Atlantic Fleet Sound School, originally established in 1939 at the submarine base in New London, was shifted to Key West. During the first 3 months of 1943, 250 officers passed through the 8 weeks course, 1,033 enlisted men began basic sound training, and 969 were graduated. In addition, the Key West Sound School trained 1,016 officers and men of 7 different foreign navies during the war, and the West Coast Sound School at San Diego kept up a steady enrollment of about 1,200 students in order to study details of fights with submarines and ascertain the causes of success or failure. An Atlantic Fleet Anti-Submarine Warfare Unit was commissioned 2 March 1942 at Boston. Collection and correlation of data, analysis and deduction were its primary functions. But it also trained instructors for the Key West Sound School, the Subchaser School at Miami, and for the various attack teachers, British mechanical devices set up at naval bases from Iceland to Brazil. Thus, the Boston unit became a sort of teachers' college for anti-submarine warfare. In every aspect of this planetary struggle, men of science worked in laboratories, inventing, developing and testing new weapons, devices and military equipment for the armed forces. One group of civilian scientists worked side by side with naval officers, even on board ships and in planes. This was the Anti-Submarine Warfare Operations Research Group, an offshoot of the National Defense Research Committee. James B. Conant, then president of Harvard University, and other scientists, visited England during the Battle for Britain and returned convinced that one of the main factors which saved England from destruction under the long-sustained assaults of the Luftwaffe was a group of operational scientists. They were working closely with Royal Air Force Fighter Command to coordinate coast warning radar with fighter plane defense. As Professor P.M.S. Blackett pointed out, relatively too much scientific effort has been expended hitherto in the production of new devices and too little in the proper use of what we have got. When assigned to anti-submarine warfare, scientists were called upon to answer such questions as: what pattern of depth charges at what settings has the best mathematical chance of killing a submarine? What sort of track should a ship steer to have the best chance of regaining a lost underwater contact? How large an expanse of ocean, under varying atmospheric conditions, can a ship or a plane profitably patrol in 1 hour? What disposition of escorts around a convoy gives optimum protection? Answers to these and 1,000 other questions on anti-submarine warfare could not be left to mere trial and error. The Battle of the Atlantic might be lost before the right answer was found, and it was not sufficient for scientists to invent a new device. They must observe its use in action in order to make improvements. At Captain Baker's suggestion, Anti-Submarine Warfare Operations Research Group was organized, 1 April 1942, with Professor Philip M. Morse, sound physicist of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, as director. Anti-Submarine Warfare Operations Research Group was centered at Washington, but individual members were sent to Norfolk, Argentia, Sea Frontier Headquarters, Trinidad, and Brazil. And very important work was done at these outlying bases. It sounds odd today, when all armed services are scientifically indoctrinated, but in 1942, practical seamen had a deep suspicion of long-haired scientists that had to be overcome. Dr. Morse, however, sold Anti-Submarine Warfare Operations Research Group by laying down the principle that no scientist was to claim credit for anything, since he took no responsibility for the ultimate decision, that his duty was simply to help the fighting navy improve its anti-submarine technique. The Anti-Submarine Warfare Operations Research Group mathematicians and analysts worked out a whole complex of search problems, including patterns of box search by ships on Greek key patterns for regaining underwater contact with a submarine. They worked up data on effective search speed, altitude, and airborne time for patrol planes. They proved that 3 destroyers searching abreast were more than 3 times as effective as a single destroyer, that an air umbrella over a convoy gave far less protection than a wide-ranging air search on front and flanks. They drafted blueprints for the Atlantic Narrows Air Patrol that caught several German blockade runners, and for the Straits of Gibraltar Patrol. And they worked up countermeasures which stymied the German acoustic torpedo as soon as it appeared. Radar was invented by Sir Robert Watson Watt, but some of its developments and refinements were produced in the United States from sheer necessity. By the summer of 1942, almost every combatant ship in the Atlantic Fleet had been equipped with some form of radar and an improved model, the Surface Search Radar, in which the scope gives a picture of what lay ahead, had passed the test of experiment and was ready to be installed in October. For aircraft, the value of radar was even greater than for ships because it enabled planes to pick up a surfaced submarine far beyond visible distance, to deliver a surprise attack, and to home in other planes and ships. The first sets installed in planes were on meter wave. The Germans invented a search receiver for it which ended its usefulness as a detecting device, and inventing a microwave plane radar to take its place became urgent. That was done, and a variety of 10-centimeter sets did the trick. The Germans never could figure out a way to detect or jam these. Microwave radar made possible the large number of kills by aircraft in the spring and early summer of 1943. Hitler referred to it peevishly in his New Year's 1944 address as one invention of our enemy which had thwarted his submarine fleet. A convoy is no stronger than its ears and eyes. Radar furnished our convoys with cat's eyes, sonar with ears, while the high-frequency direction finders, pronounced Huff-Duff by picking up and plotting radio transmissions of U-boats at sea, acted as highly sensitive, elongated cat's whiskers. The Royal Navy was the first to adopt this method of locating submarines. Estimated positions of U-boats, plotted at Washington and London, were sent out to sea on Fox schedule, which was a secret radio bulletin transmitted several times a day on a fixed schedule. While high-frequency direction finder fixes were seldom accurate within 50 or 100 miles, they enabled an escort commander to order an evasive change of course, which, by Admiral Donitz's admission, frequently frustrated his wolf packs. There is no better example of the effectiveness of the land-based high-frequency direction finder than that of the following submarine kill. About noon 30 June 1942, high-frequency direction finder ranges were obtained by the stations at Bermuda, Hartland Point, Kingston and Georgetown. Operations officers at Naval Operating Base Bermuda plotted the bearings, which made a perfect fix. Lieutenant Richard E. Schrader, in a Mariner of Squadron VP-74, patrolling out of Bermuda, was then about 50 miles away. Immediately notified, he laid his course accordingly and found U-158 idling on the surface with the crew sunning themselves on deck. He dropped a depth charge which stuck to the superstructure and detonated as the submarine went down, for keeps. The next step was the shipborne high-frequency direction finder, which began to be installed in key escort vessels in October 1942. The Germans long ignored the danger of this to them. Their U-boats continued to chatter among themselves and to Dönitz when closing a convoy, thus revealing their position. As the number of escort craft increased, it was necessary to provide special training for the young reservists who were to man them. A submarine chaser training center was commissioned at Miami in March 1942, with Lieutenant Commander E.F. McDaniel as commandant. His school opened with about 50 pupils, but by 1 January 1944, 10,396 officers and 37,574 enlisted men had been trained there for the United States Navy alone. These included the crews of 285 destroyer escorts, 256 patrol crafts, 397 submarine chasers, and 150 other craft. McDaniel was a lean, thin-lipped officer whose eyes burned with hatred of the enemy and all his works, and whose heart glowed with devotion to the Navy, especially the anti-submarine part of it. He had a sense of organization and a natural teaching ability. His faculty, like his student body, was constantly changing, for McDaniel would have for instructors none but officers who had actually hunted submarines, and back to sea they went after a few months. Before this Miami institution was many months old, the United States began to deliver subchasers under Lend-Lease to allied European and American nations, and the task of training their crews too was thrown on McDaniel. In 1942 and 1943, 360 officers and 1,374 men were trained there for 14 different foreign navies. The Army Air Force, which controlled almost the entire supply of United States military land-based planes in 1941, did not expect to include anti-submarine warfare among its duties. Army pilots were not trained to fly over water or protect shipping or bomb small moving targets like submarines, and the Navy did not have the planes to fill the role so successfully assumed by the British Coastal Command. This was due not to lack of foresight, but to a principle decided on in 1920, that the Army should control land-based and the Navy sea-based aviation. Consequently, the Army received the entire American production of military land planes, while the Navy received the entire production of seaplanes and carrier types, and the numbers were inadequate for both kinds. When British experience showed the value of large land-based bombers in anti-submarine warfare, the Army modified this agreement. On 7 July 1942, General Marshall consented to a reallocation of production that promised the Navy a fair share of Liberators and other long-range bomber types. But by that time the submarines had done their worst off the Atlantic coast. The Navy badly wanted 4-engine land-based bombers for anti-submarine work, and the Army responded to the best of its ability. By the end of July 1942, the Army had 141 planes available for anti-submarine work in Eastern Sea Frontier, and the Naval Air Arm had grown to 178 planes and 7 blimps. These were spread among 26 fields along the coast from Argentia to Jacksonville. This coverage was far from effective, partly because the Army and Navy had different communications system, partly because of a deficient command organization. At General Marshall's suggestion, Anti-Submarine Army Air Command was formed in October 1942, with Brigadier General Westside T. Larson as commander. Admiral King, however, had no intention of permanently sharing with the Army what he considered to be a naval responsibility, the protection of shipping. He conceived of Army participation in anti-submarine air warfare as a temporary expedient. So as fast as the Navy obtained land-based planes and trained pilots, they were moved into sea frontiers and Iceland and Greenland to relieve the Army Air Force of this special duty. But it should be remembered that the Army Air Force came to the Navy's assistance at a critical moment, stood by as long as it was needed, contributed to the technique of anti-submarine warfare, and killed several submarines. The naval air squadrons based at Argentia, under the successive command of Rear Admirals Bristol and Brainerd, were particularly useful in covering convoys during the critical moment of changing escort groups, and also in killing submarines. Amphibious Catalinas found a new sphere of usefulness in air-sea rescue work, and by the time the war ended, many were trained and equipped for that purpose alone. Throughout the war, the PBY was the Navy's workhorse of the air. It did everything: search, reconnaissance, transport, bombing, rescue. It was slow, ungainly, a big target for the enemy, but what a plane! Air search and attack, because of the delicate instruments and the mathematical factors involved, were peculiarly subject to improvement through the efforts of the operational scientists. The Navy set up early in 1943 the Anti-Submarine Development Detachment at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, to which many scientists were attached. This opened a new and brilliant chapter for naval air in anti-submarine warfare. In addition to the efforts, methods, and procedures to master the U-boats that we have already described, there were several auxiliary operations which accomplished little good, yet must be mentioned for their brave efforts. Probably the most useful was the Northern Ship Lane Patrol, consisting of big converted yachts such as Migrant and Guinevere, which patrolled the main convoy routes to a considerable distance offshore, and reported some useful information on submarines that enabled convoys to elude them. Second was the Coastal Picket Patrol, nicknamed the Hooligan Navy. Organised by the Coast Guard in May 1942, this consisted of auxiliary yachts and motorboats under 100 feet in length. These were taken over by the Coast Guard, often with their civilian owners as skippers, manned mostly by yachtsmen who could not pass qualifications for the Navy, armed with small guns and depth charges, and sent forth to hunt U-boats. This was too late to help repel Dönitz's first blitz along the east coast, but they patrolled faithfully during the hard winter of 1942-1943. The hooligans were too small, slow and feebly armed to make any kills. At top strength in February 1943, there were no fewer than 550 of these boats patrolling between Eastport, Maine and Galveston, Texas. From that time, the numbers were progressively reduced, and their duties assumed by 8 3-foot Coast Guard cutters. The Civil Air Patrol, organized in March 1942, was much the same thing in the air. Civilian pilots ineligible for the armed forces, some even veterans of World War I with wooden legs, contributed their planes and their services, and many of the ground crews were women. All served without pay. At the height of its strength, the Combat Air Patrol had several hundred planes operating from bases between Bar Harbor, Maine, and Corpus Christi, Texas. They never killed a submarine, but they spotted survivors from sinkings in rafts and lifeboats, and performed many auxiliary services for the armed forces. Down to September 1943, when it was disbanded, Combat Air Patrol had reported the positions of 173 enemy submarines, 91 vessels in distress, and rafts or lifeboats containing 363 survivors. In addition to their direct services, the Combat Air Patrol and the hooligans trained hundreds of young boys to be pilots, sailors, and Coast Guardsmen. Both organizations are outstanding examples of fusing civilian with military effort. At least 90% of their personnel consisted of men and women who had to earn their livings, and who could have made big money in war industries or the merchant marine. But they were people who wanted to serve, not to gain. They proved that the call to work and sacrifice is stronger and produces better service than the lure of money. There was also a mystery or Q-ship project which consumed an inordinate amount of effort and lost the lives of about 1/4 of the sailors who volunteered without accomplishing anything. These were heavily armed vessels disguised as peaceful merchantmen, which, on the approach of a U-boat, were supposed to unmask powerful batteries and sink the submarine. The Q-ships had done some good in World War I, but not nearly so much as the thriller books written about them claimed, and the U-boats of World War II were too fast and smart to be taken in by such a ruse. Nevertheless, in early 1942, the situation was so serious that Admiral King very reluctantly, in response to pressure from President Roosevelt, organized a mystery ship program. The first 3 sailed from New England ports in March. USS Attic was sunk with all hands by a U-boat off the capes of the Chesapeake when only 4 days out. Foam met a similar fate in May off Nova Scotia. 2 others, which never made a contact, and a third which made 3 unsuccessful attacks, were finally converted to weather-reporting ships, and a fourth, a 3-masted schooner, almost sank in a hurricane and was decommissioned. The building of new merchant ships to replace and surpass those lost by enemy action, under the Maritime Commission and the Warshipping Administration Board headed by Rear Admiral Emory S. Land, was highly successful, and got under way before formal war began. The first Liberty ship of 10,800 deadweight tonnage, Patrick Henry, was launched in September 1941. The first Victory ship, of about the same size but 50% faster, 2 years later. In 1942, 727 ships of 55.5 million tons were constructed. By April 1943, the Maritime Commission was building 140 ships of 1 million tons per month. And by the end of the year, these figures were doubled and the time of construction had been lowered from 244 days to an average of 42 days for a Liberty. These ships were manned by merchant mariners, for whom training schools had to be organised. Although the best protection of merchant ships from the enemy was to travel in convoy, many had to ply routes for which no escort could be spared and sailed alone. For their protection, the Navy began in early 1942 to provide merchantmen with 1 or more guns and a naval armed guard of bluejackets. This led to a great deal of friction between the merchant mariners and the naval ratings who were not under Union control or interested in pay, bonuses, or overtime. Of course, the merchant marine might have been absorbed by the Navy or made an auxiliary service like the famous Seabees. This was not done, mainly for 2 reasons. It would have antagonized the National Maritime Union, headed by the truculent Joe Curran, and it would have required far more manpower. Naval regulations would have about doubled the number of each crew. And many ancient mariners with decayed teeth or ruptures, who made good seamen for a merchant ship, could never have passed the Navy's physical requirements. As the war continued, naval armed guards and ships' crews, facing a common danger, learned to cooperate, and there were several instances of armed merchant vessels driving off and even sinking submarines. By June of 1942, the United States Navy and the Army Air Force were coming to grips with the U-boat problem, but were far from attaining mastery. The shortage of escorts was still critical. No destroyer escort had yet joined the fleet. No killer groups of escort carriers had yet been organised. On the other side, Admiral Dönitz had not exhausted his repertoire, and tough days were to come for the convoys. The admiral who relieved Raeder as Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy in January 1943 later regarded the next 2 months as the peak of U-boat achievement. A fair example of a transatlantic convoy crossing in June 1942 and of the comparatively slight improvement in anti-submarine warfare to that time is furnished by the story of Convoy ONS 102 from Londonderry to Halifax. There were 63 ships in 11 columns, protected by 9 escorts, USS Leary, 3 big Coast Guard cutters, 1 Canadian destroyer, and 4 Canadian corvettes. Commander P.R. Heinemann was escort commander in United States Coast Guard cutter Campbell. Speed of advance was 8 knots. At 7:25 a.m. June 16, 2 contacts were made through high-frequency direction finder, and 2 escorts were detached to run them down. Both made unsuccessful depth charge attacks, but the convoy was left at peace that night. The following night, 2 U-boats managed to worm in between the convoy columns, and at 1:25 a.m. torpedoed a ship. A few minutes later, Campbell, patrolling 2.5 miles ahead, sighted a submarine headed for the convoy, distant 500 yards. This U-boat submerged and was depth-charged, unsuccessfully. Admiral Brainard at Argenta, Newfoundland, now sent 4 Canadian corvettes to help Heinemann. One of them, His Majesty's Canadian ship Agassiz, sighted a U-boat a mile ahead at 10:42 p.m. June 20. It dove, and Agassiz attacked with depth charges, one of which made such a terrific explosion that several merchantmen thought themselves torpedoed and fired star shell. The resulting illumination revealed a second submarine in the middle of the convoy. The nearest merchant ship, which had a naval armed guard, attacked with gunfire and forced it to submerge. Escorts dashed about the now brightly illuminated convoy, throwing depth charges to no purpose. Radar broke down, and the U-boat escaped. Convoy ONS 102 was lucky to get through with the loss of but 1 ship. Commander Heinemann, one of the best of our escort commanders, was red-faced about the whole thing, and reported 7 different classes of errors that prevented him from getting a U-boat. The most important was the lack of uniform anti-submarine doctrine. Escort vessels needed a definite set of principles concerning how to hunt a submerged U-boat in order to make best use of available detection gear and weapons. A good beginning was made by the issuance on 9 July 1942 of a Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet Information Bulletin on Anti-Submarine Warfare, the result of intensive study by officers of the Boston Anti-Submarine Warfare Unit and its attached scientists. In clear, precise language, it described the German submarine and its capabilities, and laid down rules and methods for escort of convoy and patrol operations, for sound, sight and radar searching, and for surface, air and joint attacks. Looking backward, the increasing number of escorts, uniform doctrine, the training and analysis systems set up, and plain hard experience seem to be the most important contributions toward controlling the U-boat menace during the first half of that woeful year, 1942. Convoys were increasingly successful in protecting trade routes, but escorts were not killing enough U-boats. Only 21 of these, together with 7 Italian submarines, were sunk by both Allied navies during the first 6 months of 1942, and only 5 of these kills were by United States forces. During the same period, Germany built 123 new U-boats, and in June 1942 there were 60 of them, on an average, patrolling the Atlantic. This period of anti-submarine warfare closed with a stern warning, delivered by General Marshall to Admiral King on 19 June 1942. Of the 74 ships allocated to the Army for July by the War Shipping Administration, 17 have already been sunk. 22% of the bauxite fleet has already been destroyed, and 20% of the Puerto Rican fleet has been lost. Tanker sinkings have been 3.5% per month of tonnage in use. We're all aware of the limited number of escort craft available, but has every conceivable improvised means been brought to bear on this situation? I am fearful that another month or 2 of this will so cripple our means of transport that we will be unable to bring sufficient men and planes to bear against the enemy in critical theatres, to exercise a determining influence on the war. Admiral King's and the Navy's response to this challenge will be related in a later chapter, for we must now turn to the Pacific, where the tide of war had already turned in the Great Battle of Midway. The Pacific situation is very grave, signalled President Roosevelt to Winston Churchill on 9 March 1942. The first 4 months of 1942 were the grimmest period of the war for the Allies, everywhere. It looked as if America's entry would mean only one more victim for the Axis and Japan to strike down and tear apart. In Eastern Europe, after a winter's stalemate, the German armies had resumed their victorious advance toward the Caucasus. Crippling attacks by U-boats and Italian midget subs in Alexandria harbour had reduced the British Mediterranean fleet to a squadron of cruisers and destroyers. In the broad Atlantic and the Caribbean, merchant shipping was being sunk by submarines much faster than it could be replaced. In the Middle East, Hitler had turned Rommel loose on the British, with devastating effects. In the Far East, the Japanese were about to throw the Americans, British and Dutch out of their last strongholds. Then came a ray of light for the Allies out of the Coral Sea. Dawn broke over Midway. Russia successfully defended Moscow and Stalingrad. Auchinleck won the first battle of El Alamein in the Libyan desert, and hope returned to the forces of freedom. In the Central Pacific, the first few months after Pearl Harbor were dark indeed. Wake Island, the most important outpost between Oahu and Guam, was garrisoned by a little over 500 officers and men, mostly Marines, under Commander W. Scott Cunningham and Major James Devereux. With the help of a squadron of fighter planes and a few coast defense guns, none larger than 5-inch, they beat off a Japanese invasion on 11 December, the only occasion in the entire war when an amphibious assault was thrown back with loss. But the Japanese came back with greater force on 23 December and captured Wake after a strong naval relief force under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, built around carrier Saratoga, had been recalled by Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet. The American combatant prisoners were sent to Shanghai, the Japanese commander beheading a couple of them en route to amuse his men. About 100 civilian workers were detained on Wake to work for the enemy. These were later executed. On the last day of 1941, when Admiral King became Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet at Washington, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz became Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet. At his first meeting with Admiral Kimmel's former staff at Pearl Harbor, he assured them of his confidence and announced that they would serve him too. That act alone raised morale at Pearl Harbor from an all-time low. Nimitz, calm in demeanour and courteous in speech, with blue eyes, a pink complexion and tow-coloured hair turning white, was a fortunate appointment. He restored confidence to the decimated Pacific Fleet. He had the prudence to wait through a lean period, to do nothing rash for the sake of doing something. He had the capacity to organize both a fleet and a vast war theatre, the tact to deal with sister services and allied commands, the leadership to weld his own subordinates into a great fighting team, the courage to take necessary risks, and the wisdom to select, from a variety of intelligence and opinions, the correct strategy to defeat Japan. For the time being, nothing was practicable but hit-and-run raids, such as the British were making in Europe. In the Pacific, aircraft carriers served this strategy of weakness. Admiral Halsey's Enterprise Group raided Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands on 1 February 1942, sank a transport, badly damaged 9 other ships, and killed the Japanese atoll commander. Next, Admiral Wilson Brown's Lexington Group raided Rabaul. The Japanese Air Force based there hit back, and on 20 February an air battle between Japanese and American planes was joined. Our airmen won this round, John S. Tharch and Butch O'Hare particularly distinguishing themselves. On 10 March, Wilson Brown, his force augmented by Yorktown, launched planes from a point off Port Moresby and flew them over the Owen Stanley Range to pound the Japanese at Leh and Salamaua on the north coast of Papua. That raid, however, paled in comparison with the Halsey Doolittle one on Tokyo in April. As the fleet then had no carrier bombers with enough range to operate from outside the limit of the Japanese offshore air patrol, the Army Air Force lent 16 B-25 Mitchells, which made a deckload for carrier Hornet, Captain Mark A. Mitcher. Enterprise, Captain George D. Murray, went along to provide combat air patrol. Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance commanded the cruisers and Captain Richard Connolly the destroyers of the screen. Although B-25 pilots could be trained to take off from a carrier, the deck was too short for recovery. So the planes had to fly 668 miles from Hornet's launching point to Tokyo, bomb the city, and thence fly another 1,100 miles to friendly Chinese airfields. The strike group, led by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, were airborne by 8:24 a.m. April 18 and over the city by noon. They completely surprised the Japanese as we had been surprised by them at Pearl Harbor, and not one B-25 was lost over Japan. But some made crash landings in China or splashed off the coast, and 2 pilots picked up by the Japanese were executed, an unpleasant practice which persisted through the Pacific War and led to some of the officers responsible being hanged when it was over. This answer to Pearl Harbor did not inflict 1,000th part of the damage it was supposed to revenge, but it gave the American public, which had had nothing but bad news for 19 weeks, a great lift. The Japanese authorities, who never guessed where the bombers came from, President Roosevelt's announcement that they flew from Shangri-La didn't help much, pinned down hundreds of planes to defend Tokyo, and, what is more important, the event expedited plans for an overextension that led to the Japanese defeat at Midway. Strategic overstretch Captain Liddell Hart calls it. Victory disease, a Japanese admiral, named it after the war. Imperial General Headquarters, not content with the most rapid, stupendous conquest made in modern times, now embarked on a plan for still further aggression. First, Tulagi in the Solomons and Port Moresby in Papua would be seized to secure air mastery of the Coral Sea. The combined fleet would cross the Pacific to annihilate the United States Pacific Fleet and at the same time capture Midway Island and the Western Aleutians. Then set up a ribbon defence anchored at Attu, Midway, Wake and the Marshalls and Gilberts. This effort, had it not been thwarted by the Battle of Midway, would have been followed by invasion of New Caledonia, the Fijis and Samoa, to isolate Australia. The one really sound part of this grandiose plan, even though it failed, was Admiral Yamamoto's challenge to the Pacific Fleet. He knew that the destruction of the fleet must be completed before 1943, when American war production would make it too late. With Pacific Fleet wiped out, Japan could make her ribbon defence impregnable and organise her conquests. Americans would tire of a futile war and negotiate a peace which would leave Japan master of the Pacific. Such was the plan and the confident expectation of the warlords in Tokyo. The Coral Sea is one of the world's most beautiful bodies of water. Typhoons pass it by. The southeast trades blow fresh across its surface almost the entire year. raising whitecaps which build up to long surges that crash on Australia's Great Barrier Reef in a 1,500-mile line of white foam. Lying between the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn, it knows no winter, and the summer is never uncomfortably hot. The islands on the eastern and northern verges, New Caledonia, the New Hebrides, the Louisiades, are lofty, jungle-clad and ringed with coral beaches and reefs. Here the interplay of bright sunlight, pure air and transparent water may be seen at its best. Peacock-hued shoals over the coral gardens break off abruptly from an emerald-hued fringe into deeps of brilliant amethyst. Under occasional overcasts, the coral sea becomes a warm dove-grey instead of assuming the bleak dress of the ocean in high latitudes. Only in its northern bight, the Bismarck Sea, does the coral sea wash sombre shores of lava and volcanic ash. That bight had been dominated by Japan since January 1942, from her easily won base at Rabaul. It was now time, in the view of her war planners, that she swing around the New Guinea bird's tail and move into the dancing waters of the broad Coral Sea. Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Intelligence smoked out the gist of this plan by 17 April, and Admiral Nimitz saw to it that Task Force 17, a two-carrier group, Lexington and Yorktown, under Rear Admiral Fletcher, was there to spoil it. That is why the Coral Sea, where no more serious fights had taken place in days gone by than those between trading schooners and Melanesian war canoes, became the scene of the first great naval action between aircraft carriers, the first naval battle in which no ship on either side sighted the other. The Japanese operation plan was not simple. Her naval strategists believed in dividing forces. There were three main divisions. One, a left-prong, Rear Admiral Shima, to occupy Tulagi in the Lower Solomons and establish a seaplane base whence Noumea could be neutralized. 2, a right-prong Rear Admiral Kajioka's Port Moresby invasion group, floating a sizable army in a dozen transports, covered by heavy cruisers and light carrier Shoho to start from Rabaul, whip through Jomard Passage in the Louisiades, and capture Port Moresby. 3, Vice Admiral Takagi's big carrier striking force, including Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor, to enter the Coral Sea from the east, and destroy anything the Allies might offer to interfere with this plan. The whole was to be directed from Rabaul by Commander-in-Chief Fourth Fleet, Vice Admiral Inouye. Admiral Nimitz did not have even half this force at his disposal, but he put together under Admiral Fletcher's command all he had, and gave him no more specific orders than to stop the enemy. Fletcher in Lexington, familiar with the Coral Sea, came steaming west from Pearl Harbor. Yorktown, already known as the Waltzing Matilda of the Pacific Fleet, was ordered to cut short a period of upkeep at Tongatabu, waltz over to the Coral Sea and rendezvous with Lady Lex. Most of the ships of MacArthur's Navy, not yet named Seventh Fleet, also joined. These were 3 cruisers, His Majesty's Australian ship Australia and Hobart, USS Chicago, and a few destroyers, under the command of Rear Admiral J.G. Crace. The ensuing action was full of mistakes, both humorous and tragic, wrong estimates and assumptions, bombing the wrong ships, missing great opportunities and cashing in accidentally on minor ones. The Japanese won the first trick. Admiral Shima's group occupied Tulagi unopposed on 3 May. They took the second too on 4 May, when Yorktown's planes bombed Tulagi and did only minor damage. At the same time, however, Japan missed her best chance to win this game through false economy. To save an extra ferrying mission, Shokaku and Zuikaku were ordered to deliver 9 fighter planes to Rabaul. This delayed the 2 big carriers 2 days, so that on the 4th they were too far away to counterattack Fletcher. Nothing much happened on the 5th and 6th, when each big carrier force was searching for its enemy without success. At one time, they were only 70 miles apart. That 6th day of May, when General Wainwright surrendered Corregidor in the Philippines, marked the low point of the entire war for American arms. But the next day opened with a bright dawn. This transition from Corregidor to the Coral Sea is startling and dramatic. At dawn on the 7th, Shokaku and Zuikaku sent out a search mission for an enemy force they suspected to be in the Coral Sea. The search planes sighted Fletcher's retiring fueling group, fleet oiler Neosho and destroyer Sims, and made the second big mistake of this error-crowded battle by reporting them to be a carrier and a cruiser. Admiral Takagi promptly ordered an all-out bombing attack on this hapless couple and sank them both. This caused Rear Admiral Hara, the carrier division commander under Takagi, much chagrin, cost him 6 planes, and saved the American carriers from attack. The American planes, however, were off on a similar wild goose chase. That particular boo-boo had resulted from the report of a Yorktown search plane at 8:15 a.m. May 7 of 2 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers about 175 miles northwest of the American force. Fletcher, naturally assuming that this meant Takagi's striking force, launched full deckloads to go after it. When these aircraft were already airborne, it was discovered that the 2 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers, owing to a disarrangement of the pilot's code contact pad, should have been reported as 2 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers. Nevertheless, by good luck, the Lexington and Yorktown flyers encountered light carrier Shoho, piled in on her, and put her under in a matter of 10 minutes, a record for the entire war. Scratch 1 flat top signalled Lexington's dive bomber commander. It was not the right flat top, but the loss of Shoho so discouraged Admiral Inouye that he ordered the Port Moresby invasion group, instead of pressing on through Jomard Passage, to gill around at a safe distance north of the Louisiades. Thus, our attack on the wrong carrier thwarted the enemy's main object. More grim humour on the 7th was furnished by Crace's chase. Fletcher gallantly weakened his carrier's screen by detaching Rear Admiral Crace with his 2 Australian cruisers, USS Chicago and a few destroyers, to find and attack the Port Moresby invasion force. Crace handled this mixed group so efficiently as to beat off 31 land-based bombers from Rabaul without receiving a scratch, and he also fought off 3 United States Army Air Force B-17s from the Townsville, Queensland base, which thought his ships were Japanese. To cap this comedy, the thwarted Japanese planes claimed to have sunk 2 battleships and a heavy cruiser. Toward evening of the same day, 7 May, Takagi sent a search attack mission to find and bomb Fletcher's carriers. They missed the flat tops, but had a rough experience. First, they were intercepted by Fletcher's fighter planes and lost 9 of their number. Then, after dark, 6 tried to land on Yorktown, mistaking her for Japanese, and 11 more were lost trying to make night landings on their own carriers. On 8 May came the payoff. The 2 major carrier groups under Fletcher and Takagi, or to use the actual officer in tactical commands of the carriers, Fitch and Hara, which had been fumbling for one another for the better part of 3 days and nights, finally came to grips. Each located the other and attacked. Never were forces more even. The Japanese admiral with the Irish name had 121 planes. Jakey Fitch had 122. Hara had a screen of 4 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers. Fitch, now Crace was away, had but 1 more of each type. Nature, however, gave the Japanese carriers one great advantage. They were in a belt of heavy overcast, which had moved into the Coral Sea from the Solomons, whilst the Americans were out in the clear under brilliant sunshine. Thus, the Yorktown attack group, 41 planes strong, missed Zuikaku under a rain squall, concentrated on Shokaku and obtained only 2 bomb hits. But one of these bent the flight deck so that she could no longer launch planes. Half Lexington's attack group failed to find the fog-enshrouded enemy. The other half gave Shokaku another bomb hit. Takagi, who by this time, noon 8 May, believed that both American carriers were sinking, decided he could dispense with the damaged carrier and sent her back to Truk. His assumption was about half correct. The Japanese attack group, amounting to about 70 planes, gave both American carriers a severe working over. Yorktown took 1 bomb hit which killed 66 men. Lexington took 2 torpedoes and 2 bomb hits. The end of the battle found Lady Lex listing, with 3 fires burning but her power plant intact. There was every prospect of damage control quenching the fires, when suddenly she was racked by 2 internal explosions which forced Captain Frederick Sherman to abandon ship. This was done skillfully, some 150 wounded being lowered in basket stretchers into motor whaleboats, while the able-bodied slid down lines into the water, where they were picked up by destroyers. Rear Admiral Tom Kincaid, who handled these rescue operations, showed the qualities that helped him to emerge as one of our great flag officers. Lady Lex, beloved as few warships have been by her crew, some of whom had been on board since she was commissioned in 1927, finally had to be sunk by a friendly destroyer's torpedoes. Her loss gave the Japanese the winning score in tonnage sunk, but that does not register the effect of the battle. Admiral Inouye, fearful of risking the Port Moresby invasion force south of Papua without air cover, ordered it to retire to Rabaul, and never again in this war did the keel of a Japanese warship vex the Coral Sea south of the Louisiades. Thus the battle was really won by the Americans owing to their biggest mistake, the sighting and bombing of Shoho. Her loss led Inouye to throw in the sponge. Even the big carriers battle turned out ill for the Japanese, because Shokaku took 2 months to repair, and Zuikaku took over 1 month to replace her plane losses. Thus, neither big flat top could take part in the great battle coming up, but Yorktown could and did. Even before the sea warriors of Japan began roaring into the Coral Sea, word had reached Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor of a second offensive that threatened to be much the more powerful and dangerous. Imperial General Headquarters issued the order that put the wheels in motion on 5 May 1942. Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet will, in cooperation with the Army, invade and occupy strategic points in the Western Aleutians and Midway Island. The objectives were threefold. The named islands were wanted as anchors in the New Ribbon defense, and Midway too as a base for air raids on Pearl Harbor. But most of all, Admiral Yamamoto intended this operation to draw out and annihilate the United States Pacific Fleet in its hour of greatest weakness, before new construction could replace the losses of Pearl Harbor. The success of this battle was central to the entire Japanese strategic concept of the war. Had Japan won, Port Moresby, Fijis, anything else she wanted, would have fallen into her lap. But the yet small Pacific Fleet declined to accept the sacrificial role. Midway, situated 1,136 miles west-northwest of Pearl Harbor, is the outermost link of the Hawaiian chain. The entire atoll, smaller even than Wake, is but 6 miles in diameter. Only 2 islets, Sand and Eastern, the first less than 2 miles long and the other a little more than 1, are dry land. It had been a Pan-American Airways base since 1935 and a naval air station since August 1941. A comparison of the combined fleet thrown into this operation with what Admiral Nimitz could collect to withstand it indicates that Yamamoto's expectations of annihilation were justified. He commanded 1. An advance force of 16 submarines, 2. Nagumo's Pearl Harbor striking force, with 4 big carriers, 3. A Midway occupation force, some 5,000 men in 12 transports protected by 2 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers and numerous destroyers, 4. A main body under Yamamoto's immediate command, comprising Japan's 3 most modern battleships and 4 older ones, with a light carrier, and 5. The Northern Area Force, with 2 light carriers, 2 heavy cruisers and 4 big transports for the bombing of Dutch Harbour and occupation of Adak, Attu and Kiska. This added up to 162 warships and auxiliaries, not counting small patrol craft and the like, practically the entire fighting Japanese navy. The total number that Admiral Nimitz could scrape together was 76, of which 1/3 belonged to the North Pacific Force and never got into the battle. Nevertheless, Nimitz had certain assets which helped tip the scale. The senior commander of the carrier striking force, which did most of the fighting, was Rear Admiral Fletcher in Yorktown, repaired at Pearl Harbor in 2 days, when by peacetime methods it would have taken 90, and Fletcher had learned a thing or two at the Coral Sea. Junior to him, and in temporary command of Halsey's Task Force 16, which had pulled off the Tokyo strike, was Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. He, though not an aviator, showed in the forthcoming battle the very highest quality of tactical wisdom, the power to seize opportunities. Enterprise and Hornet, the carriers under him, had 2 superlative commanding officers, Captains George D. Murray and Marker Mitcher. In Midway itself, where 32 Navy Catalinas and 6 of the new torpedo-bombing Avengers, 54 Marine Corps planes and 23 Army Air Force planes, 19 of them B-17s, were based, we had an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Finally, Nimitz had the inestimable advantage of knowing when and where the enemy intended to attack. But for early and abundant decrypted intelligence, and what was more important, the prompt piecing together of these bits and scraps to make a pattern, United States Navy could never have coped with the Japanese Goliath. Admiral Nimitz's orders to Fletcher and Spruance were to inflict maximum damage on enemy by employing strong attrition tactics, which meant airstrikes on enemy ships. He cannily ordered them to take initial positions to the northeastward of Midway, beyond search range of the approaching enemy, anticipating that the 700-mile searches by Midway-based planes would locate the Japanese carriers first. To this, he added a special letter of instruction. In carrying out the task assigned, you will be governed by the principle of calculated risk, the avoidance of exposure of your force to attack by superior enemy forces, without good prospect of inflicting greater damage on the enemy. No commander-in-chief's instructions were ever more faithfully and intelligently carried out. Yamamoto really threw away his chance of a smashing victory by dividing his mammoth forces several ways, and by fitting his operation plan to what he assumed the Americans would do. Dividing forces was a fixed strategic idea with the Japanese. They loved diversionary tactics, fleets popping up at odd places to confuse the enemy and pull him off base. Their pattern for decisive battle was the same at sea as on land: lure the enemy into an unfavourable tactical situation, cut off his retreat, drive in his flanks, and then concentrate for the kill. Their manual for carrier force commanders even invoked the examples of Hannibal at Cannae and Ludendorff at Tannenberg, probably studied in Schlieffen's works, to justify such naval strategy as Yamamoto tried at Midway. Thus, the preliminary airstrike on Dutch Harbour, set for 3 June, was a gambit to pull the Pacific Fleet up north, where it could not interfere with the occupation of Midway Island, due to take place at dawn 6 June. When the Pacific Fleet hastened south after a fruitless run up north, which could not be earlier than 7 June, Japanese carrier planes and Midway-based aircraft would intensively bomb the American ships. These, if they did not promptly sink, would be dispatched by gunfire from Yamamoto's battleships and heavy cruisers. So very, very neat. But Nimitz, instead of falling for this trap, had 3 carriers already covering Midway as Nagumo approached. It was the Nips who were nipped. The Japanese Aleutian prong struck first on 3 June, with the triple object of deceiving Admiral Nimitz into the belief that this was the main show, destroying American installations at Dutch Harbour and covering an occupation of the Western Aleutians. Besides separate occupation forces, Vice Admiral Hosogaya had light carriers Ryujo and Junyo, 3 heavy cruisers, and a suitable number of destroyers and oilers. On our side, we had the North Pacific Force commanded by Rear Admiral Robert A. Theobald in light cruiser Nashville, with sister ships St. Louis and Honolulu, 2 heavy cruisers, a destroyer division, including a 9-destroyer striking group, 6 S-class submarines, and a flock of Coast Guard cutters and other small craft. Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Intelligence smoked out Japanese intentions in this quarter, and informed the Admiral of them on 28 May, but Fuzzy Theobald, as usual, thought he knew better, that the enemy was going to seize Dutch Harbour. Consequently, he deployed the main body of his force about 400 miles south of Kodiak, instead of trying to break up the Western Aleutians invasion force. This bad guess lost him all opportunity to fight, for Hosogaya's 2 light carriers, under the tactical command of Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, slipped in between Theobald's force and the land, began bombing Dutch Harbour at 8 a.m. June 3, and returned through a fog mole for another whack at this Eastern Aleutians base next day, completely unmolested from the sea. The Japanese could have landed at Dutch Harbour, for all the protection it had from Theobald. Considerable damage was inflicted on this base, but it was far from being knocked out. On 7 June, undefended Attu and Kiska in the Western Aleutians were occupied by the Japanese according to plan, but Adak was not taken because it seemed to be too near Unmak. Army P-40s based on the new Army Air Force or Forces Field at Unmak had given Kakuta's carrier planes quite a run for their money. Turning now to the main show, Old Man Weather seemed determined to help the Japanese here, as in the Coral Sea. Admiral Nagumo's striking force, built around carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, veterans of Pearl Harbor, advanced toward Midway under heavy cloud cover. They could even hear the island-based search planes buzzing overhead, but themselves were not seen. The force allotted to occupy Midway was, however, sighted by a Catalina on 3 June. Captain Simard's island-based air force reacted quickly, though ineffectively. It made but one hit on an oiler at 1:43 a.m. June 4. That was the first blow in this battle south of the Aleutians. All night, 3 to 4 June, the two opposing carrier forces were approaching each other on courses which, if maintained, would have crossed a few miles north of Midway Island. Day began to break around 4 a.m. It was still overcast over the Japanese, clear over the Americans. A light wind blew from the southeast, another break for the Japanese. Since wind is almost as important for aircraft carriers as for the old frigates, contrary to what was desirable in the sailing navy to get the weather gauge of your enemy, the lee gauge was now wanted because a carrier has to steam into the wind to launch or recover planes. Thus, Fletcher and Spruance, having the weather gauge, had to lose mileage during flight operations. Yorktown, having to recover a search mission, had to lag behind when the big news arrived, shortly after 6 a.m. June 4. This news was a Midway-based PBY's contact report of two Japanese carriers, headed southeast. For 4 hours this was all the information that Fletcher and Spruance had of Nagumo's location and course, but it was enough. Fletcher promptly ordered Spruance, with Enterprise and Hornet, to proceed southwesterly and attack enemy carriers when definitely located, promising to follow as soon as his search planes were recovered. Both admirals knew very well that Nagumo's striking force was Yamamoto's jugular vein, and that their only hope was to cut it. 10 minutes after Fletcher issued that pivotal order, the next phase of the Battle of Midway opened over the island itself. 108 Japanese planes, divided evenly between fighters, dive bombers and torpedo bombers, took off from the four carriers before sunrise. Midway search radar picked them up 93 miles away, and every fighter on the island was scrambled to intercept, but they were too few, and the Marine Corps Buffaloes too weak and slow to stop the Japanese. The bombing of Midway began at 6:30 a.m. and continued for 20 minutes. It did considerable ground damage without breaking up the runways, and Midway anti-aircraft fire was very good. Between that and the Marine fighters, 15 of which were lost, about 1/3 of the Japanese attack group was shot down or badly damaged. In the meantime, 4 waves of American Midway-based bombers had flown off to counterattack Nagumo's carriers. They, too, lost heavily, but, as we shall see, their sacrifice was not in vain. Now came the most decisive moment in a battle filled with drama. Admiral Nagumo, when sending off that 108-plane strike on Midway, reserved 93 aircraft armed with bombs and torpedoes to deal with enemy ships, if he could find any. Usually the Japanese were smarter than we in air search, but this time they failed, largely because, according to the Japanese plan, no American carriers should have been around for a couple of days. So Nagumo sent only a few cruiser float planes on routine search, and by 7 a.m. they had found nothing. At that moment, Lieutenant Tomonoga, commander of what was left of the 108-plane strike then returning to their carriers, signalled to Nagumo that Midway needed another pounding. Immediately after, there came in on the Japanese carriers the first Midway-based bombing attack, which seemed to second Tomonoga's motion. Obviously, Midway had plenty of bite left. So the Admiral broke the spot and ordered the 93 planes struck below to be rearmed with incendiary and fragmentation bombs for use against the island. 15 minutes elapsed, and the Admiral was dumbfounded to receive a search plane's report of 10 enemy ships to the northeast, where no American ships were supposed to be. What to do? Nagumo mulled it over for another quarter hour, cancelled the former change bomb plan, and ordered the 93 planes again rearmed and readied to attack ships. That took time, and it was already too late to fly those planes off to attack enemy ships, because flight decks had to be kept clear to receive the rest of the Japanese aircraft which had been bombing Midway. At 8:35 a.m., when the returning bombers began landing on the Japanese carriers, American birds carrying death and destruction were already winging their way from Enterprise and Hornet. Spruance had taken over from Halsey as Chief of Staff, Captain Miles Browning, one of the most irascible and unstable officers ever to earn a 4th stripe, but a man with a slide-rule brain. Browning figured out that Nagumo would order a second strike on Midway, that he would continue steaming toward the island, and that the golden opportunity to hit his carriers would arrive when they were refueling planes for this second strike. Spruance accepted these estimates and made the tough decision to launch at 7 a.m., when about 175 miles from the enemy's calculated position, instead of continuing for another 2 hours in order to diminish the distance. Spruance also decided to make this an all-out attack, a full deck load of 20 Wildcat fighters, 67 Dauntless dive bombers, and 29 Devastator torpedo bombers, and it took an hour to get all these airborne. Fletcher properly decided to delay launching from Yorktown in case more targets were discovered, but by 9:06 a.m. his 6 fighters, 17 Dauntless dive bomber and 12 Devastator torpedo bomber were also in the air. Imagine, if you will, the tense, crisp briefing in the ready room, the warming up of planes which the devoted ground crews have been checking, arming, fueling and servicing, the ritual of the takeoff, as precise and ordered as a ballet, planes swooping in graceful curves over the ships while the group assembles. This 4th of June was a cool, beautiful day. Pilots at 19,000 feet could see all around a circle of 50 miles radius. Only a few fluffy cumulus clouds were between them, and an ocean that looked like a dish of wrinkled blue Persian porcelain. It was a long flight, and alas, for so many brave young men, a last flight over the superb ocean. Try to imagine how they felt at first sight of enemy flat tops and their wriggling screen, with wakes like the tails of white horses. The sudden catch at their hearts when the black puffs of anti-aircraft bursts came nearer and nearer, then the dreaded Zeeks of Japanese combat air patrol swooping down out of the central blue. And finally, the tight, incredibly swift attack, when a pilot forgets everything but the target so rapidly enlarging, and the desperate necessity of choosing the exact 10th of a second to release and pull out. While these bright ministers of death were on their way, Nagumo's striking force continued for over an hour, as Miles Browning had calculated, to steam toward Midway. The 4 carriers were grouped in a box-like formation in the center of a screen of 2 battleships, 3 cruisers and 11 destroyers. Every few minutes messages arrived from reconnaissance planes that the enemy was approaching. At 9:05 a.m., just before the last of the planes returning from Midway were recovered, Nagumo ordered striking force to turn degrees left, to course east-northeast, to contact and destroy the enemy task force. His carriers were in exactly the condition that Spruance and Browning hoped to find them, planes being refueled and rearmed in feverish haste. Now came a break for Nagumo. His change of course caused the dive bombers and fighters from Hornet to miss him altogether. Hornet's torpedo bombers, under Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, sighted his smoke and attacked without fighter cover. The result was a massacre of all 15 Devastator torpedo bomber. Every single one was shot down by Zeeks or anti-aircraft fire. Only 1 pilot survived. The torpedo squadron from Enterprise came in next and lost 10 out of 14. Then Yorktown's, which lost all but 4, and not a single hit for all this sacrifice. No wonder that these torpedo bombers, misnamed Devastators, were struck off the Navy's list of combat planes. The 3rd torpedo attack was over by 10:24 a.m., and for about 100 seconds the Japanese were certain they had won the Battle of Midway and the war. This was their high tide of victory. Then, a few seconds before 10:26 a.m., with dramatic suddenness, there came a complete reversal of fortune, wrought by the Dauntless dive bombers. The Dauntless dive bomber, the most successful and beloved by aviators of all our carrier types during the war. Lieutenant Commander Clarence W. McCluskey, Air Group Commander of Enterprise, had 2 squadrons of Dauntless dive bomber under him, 37 units. He ordered one to follow him in attacking carrier Kaga, while the other, under Lieutenant W. E. Gallagher, pounced on Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. Their coming in so soon after the last torpedo bombing attack meant that the Zeeks were still close to the water after shooting down Devastator torpedo bomber and had no time to climb. At 14,000 feet, the American dive bombers tipped over and swooped screaming down for the kill. Akagi took a bomb which exploded in the hangar, detonating torpedo storage, then another which exploded amid planes changing their armament on the flight deck, just as Browning had calculated. Fires swept the flagship. Admiral Nagumo and staff transferred to cruiser Nagara, and the carrier was abandoned and sunk by a destroyer's torpedo. 4 bomb hits on Kaga killed everyone on the bridge and set her burning from stem to stern. Abandoned by all but a small damage control crew, she was racked by an internal explosion that evening, and sank hissing into a 2,600-fathom deep. The third carrier was the victim of Yorktown's dive bombers, under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell F. Leslie, who by cutting corners managed to make up for a late start. His 17 Dauntless dive bomber jumped Soryu just as she was turning into the wind to launch planes, and planted 3 half-ton bombs in the midst of the spot. Within 20 minutes, she had to be abandoned. United States submarine Nautilus, prowling about looking for targets, pumped 3 torpedoes into her. The gasoline storage exploded, whipsawing the carrier, and down she went in 2 sections. At 10:24 a.m., Japan had been on top. 6 minutes later, on that bright June morning, 3 of her big carriers were on their flaming way to death. But Nagumo did not give up. He ordered Hiryu, the one undamaged carrier, to strike Yorktown. Her 2 attack groups comprised 18 dive bombers, 10 torpedo bombers, and 12 fighters. Most of them were shot down by combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire, but 3 Vals of the first strike made as many bomb hits, and 4 Kates, breaking low through a heavy curtain of fire, got 2 torpedoes into Yorktown at 2:45 p.m. These severed all power connections and caused her to list 26 degrees. 15 minutes later, Captain Buckmaster ordered abandon ship. Yorktown's watertight integrity had been impaired in the Coral Sea battle, and her repairs were so hasty that he feared she would turn turtle. Admiral Fletcher, who shifted his flag to cruiser Astoria after the first attack, had already sent out a search mission to find the 4th Japanese carrier. Almost at the same moment that Yorktown was torpedoed, these planes found Hiryu. As a result of their contact, Waltzing Matilda was revenged just as her dancing career ended. Enterprise, at Spruance's command, turned into the wind at 3:30 p.m. and launched an attack group of 24 Dauntless dive bomber, including 10 refugees from Yorktown and veterans of the morning's battle. Led by the redoubtable Gallagher, they jumped Hiryu and her screen at 5 p.m. The carrier received 4 hits which did her in, and she took down with her Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, an outstanding flag officer who, it is said, would have been Yamamoto's successor had he lived. Yamamoto, who according to plan was keeping well to the rear his main body, built around the mastodonic battleship Yamato, first reacted to these events aggressively. He ordered Kakuta's 3 light carriers down from the Aleutians, and Kondo's heavy cruiser covering group to join main body next day, to renew the battle. He still had overwhelming gunfire and torpedo superiority over anything that Spruance and Fletcher could offer. But after news arrived that his 4 splendid carriers were either sunk or burning derelicts, he bowed to the logic of events, and at 2:55 a.m. June 5 ordered a general retirement. He had lost his entire fast carrier group, with their complement of some 250 planes, most of their pilots, and about 10 PM officers and men. In all its long history, the Japanese Navy had never known defeat. No wonder that Yamamoto fell ill and kept close to his cabin during the homeward passage. Never has there been a sharper turn in the fortunes of war than on that June day when McCluskey's and Leslie's dive bombers snatched the palm of victory from Nagumo's masthead, where he had nailed it on 7 December. The 4th of June, day that should live forever glorious in our history, decided the Battle of Midway. By destroying the 4 Japanese carriers and their air groups, the American aviators had extracted the sting from combined fleet.